these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
We hold these truths.
with Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
All right. Hey, everybody. So in the news, you're hearing all about the Omnibus, the dreaded Omnibus. Of course, that's referring to our annual discretionary budget that's, supposed to be passed every year. Sometimes it's passed in different ways. Sometimes there's a government shutdown. Sometimes there's what's called a continuing resolution, where you're really just passing the same spending levels as last time. And then there's sometimes an omnibus, where you take 12 different appropriations bills and just stuff them all into one big bill. It's often negotiated by, your sort of top four, the four corners, let's call it, of the Republicans and Democrat leadership. And it really rubs a lot of people the wrong way. We're going to get into the politics of that. We're going to get into the history of the budget, how it's passed, what goes into it, the politics of it. I want this to be a very basic and neutral conversation on how we do things up here and kind of why it got that way. Of course, like any other good podcast that y'all listen to, I have some help today. And you're going to hear from some great guests, maybe the best guests ever, because they're actually on my staff. I've got Matt Hodge here, my legislative director, and I've got Hannah Anderson, who is my legislative director of E&C portfolio, which is the Energy and Commerce portfolio. She's also the voice that you hear when you hear the intro to this podcast. One of the first voices, there's many voices, of course, but one of the first voices that says, we hold these truths.
You should all be so lucky.
This is very...
This is going to be your least listened to episode, so I'm very sorry about that. You got the two most boring people in the office on the podcast.
It might be the best, Hannah. Let's don't sell yourself short. So it's late tonight. Let's give some people some context. We're waiting to go to the. I'm waiting to go to the Florida. President Zelensky of Ukraine is actually speaking to everyone tonight, and so you're seeing some predictable outrage on Twitter about that. We'll get into the Ukraine spending at some point on this podcast and what's real and what isn't. Because there's a lot of misconceptions out there about how much money we've actually given Ukraine, why we're doing it. And look, I agree with some of the money we've given Ukraine. I disagree with some of it. But the truth is, we have not given them pallets of cash worth $100 billion. It's just not even close to that. The truth is, we give them weapons, and those have value, and so we associate a dollar amount to that. We do give them some money to fund operations. That money is very closely tracked. To the extent that we give them weapons, and to the extent that there's this idea that people are taking those weapons and selling them, that's almost impossible given how the process works. And then there's some humanitarian aid that I think the Europeans should really bear the brunt of instead of us. But let's back up here. Matt, I want to get some history here on your take. You've been on the Hill for a while, and you've seen us sometimes go through some sort of regular order, sometimes not. I've actually only been here when we're in the minority, and these omnibus bills and CRs have really been the only thing that I have personally seen. How is the budget process intended to happen in a perfect world where things just happen and there's no politics involved?
Yeah, it's a great question to set this up. I mean, ideally, it's supposed to start at the very beginning of the year, where Congress passes a budget resolution. And that sets out top line levels for each of the 12 appropriation subcommittees. And they go through and they just begin the work of holding hearings and marking up their individual bills. And that's supposed to lead into bills reaching the floor as standalone bills where members can offer amendments, vote on them individually. The biggest one of those bills is the defense appropriations bill. It's roughly half of the discretionary budget. And Republicans have been pretty good at passing those bills early in the year when they're in control. The Democrats have taken a completely different approach. They use that as leverage to try to get higher spending levels for each of the other bills. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where the breakdown has originated. It's always over leverage. It's over trying to figure out how the bills can be packaged. As you said, in some years it's packaged together in very unique ways. In one recent year where Republicans were in control, we packaged a defense bill with a labor, health and human services, and education bill. And that was a good formula because it passed both House and Senate and was signed into law. And ideally we do that before the end of the fiscal year, and if we can't, we end up passing a continuing resolution, which is where we stand today. We're operating under a CR, a continuing resolution, and we're debating a massive 12-bill Omni, which has a bunch of extraneous measures, a bunch of authorizing provisions, and emergency spending as well.
And, history of how the budget process works in the Congress, modern history started in the early 70s with the budget wars, as they call it, under Nixon. And Nixon wanted to impound certain line items. He wanted to say, okay, Congress, you passed this spending, but I'm just not going to spend it, because and so that started this really a constitutional fight about what the job of the president is. Created the current process that we deal with today, which we kind of follow, sometimes not follow. There's other rules. It's not just the 12 appropriations bills. And so you got your budget committee that has not really written a budget, or even really, it's
they can always skip that part.
Yeah.
One of the things the Democrats have done is they focus on these big reconciliation bills. And they've totally skipped the regular order budget process. And they've gone right to marking up these big bills, which allow them to kind of skirt bills through the Senate with only 50 votes. Yeah. And it's much harder to actually write a budget which constrains their own leadership and which keeps things on track. They would much rather just short circuit their own process.
Yeah, I mean, many would argue like, nobody's done it really well. So there was another kind of budget war that happened, right? 2011. This is post financial crisis. There's some grassroots anger bubbling up about spending on Wall Street as opposed to Main Street. I mean, we all kind of remember that. This is the rise of the Tea Party. That when it was clearly focused on budgetary issues as opposed to whatever it is now, and that created some different processes as well. It created the sequestration issues, created the pay-go, which means we pay as you go, which means if you're going to spend more money, create new programs, you have to have a way to pay for it. There's cut-go, which is kind of the Republican preferred method of keeping the budget on a strict strict kind of balance. Just cut for programs if you're going to create other programs. The question is how much has the Congress really followed either of those rules since they were put into law in 2011?
Yeah, not very well. I mean, we've kind of followed it to some extent. Other years we've completely ignored those budget constraints. And one of the things that's probably shocking to most people is that it's as easy as just like flipping a switch to turn some of those budget control mechanisms off.
Turns out a law can be changed by another law, and the budget is a law.
Exactly.
And then you just waive this budget. There's a portion of every budget that waives whatever rules are in place, which I guess is why everybody's always yelling about a constitutional amendment to balance the budget.
What was wild to me is that one of these like budget rules, sequestration, lawmakers were like, okay, we're going to get serious this time. And if you don't get serious about balancing the budget and actually reducing the deficit, if you don't get serious, we're going to cut Medicare. So they cut Medicare. They said, you're not balancing the budget. You're not reducing the deficit. You're not doing what you were supposed to do. So they instituted mandatory cuts to Medicare, which now every year we have to say, okay, we're not going to cut Medicare, all resulting from this decision back in, 2011, 2013, that lawmakers were like, okay, we're going to hold ourselves to the fire this time for real, guys, for real, because if we don't get it together, we're cutting Medicare. Of course, we didn't get it together, and every year we say we now have to wave it back. Yes.
Yeah, and when we say cut Medicare, we mean reimbursement rates.
Reimbursement rates from everyone from doctors to hospitals. So it's always a will they or won't they, but Congress always we always, waive that sequestration rule again, because people cannot imagine like what would happen if we start cutting benefits to seniors or cutting reimbursement for hospitals and doctors.
Yeah, and that gets kind of to a point I want to make before we even get into the details of the modern budget fight, today's budget fight. It's the fact that no matter what kind of rules and structures we come up with, it doesn't change the underlying political realities that we deal with, which is severe disagreements on what the government should be doing and spending money on. And the other political reality, which is that neither party really, or maybe rarely ever, has the majorities required to just push their side of the agenda through. And so compromise is necessary, and you end up with something that makes everybody upset, which is sort of the a key aspect of some kind of compromise. Have you all seen some of the best ideas out there on how we could change the process that would actually hold the Congress accountable, no matter who's in charge, no matter what the political dynamics are?
I'm an idealist, and I also I love the authorizing side. And just, if you don't mind, y'all are both a little wonks when it comes to the budget space. So I have to do my part and go back to I'm just a bill sitting here on Capitol Hill, Schoolhouse Rock. So what you learn in school is that there's a budget process. The budget numbers are set. Those numbers are sent to the committees. This is why the committees are so important, because they're supposed to be the ones saying, this is what we're going to spend our money on. They're designing the plan. They're authorizing the programs. They're saying we have enough money to do a grant program here, and so we should be taking away a grant program here. And then it turns over to the appropriators, and the appropriators are pulling the money out of the piggy bank and saying, okay, authorizers, you did the hard work, Energy and Commerce, Ed and Labor, T&I, other committees. And they're saying, okay, you have worked within your own budget that was given, your set amount you can spend. So now we are paying for it. So that, ideally, that's why we say regular order at the committee. That's why it's so important to have people engaged in committee activity. That's why it's important to get numbers from the budget committee and given to the other committees, again, like Energy and Commerce, that has jurisdiction over energy, over healthcare, over telecom, over technology, et cetera, because we're given an amount that we can spend. And if the authorizers, if the process works as it's intended, you will have compromise, you'll have budget constraints, and it will be able to go through. But of course, all of that's been thrown up in the air to say the only people that matter to get things across the finish line are the appropriators.
Right.
So we have a lot of,
because it's the last step.
Yeah.
And that's where all the negotiations end up happening, because in my time here, I've never really seen the budget committee have a say in anything. It's where you send freshmen. It's really, and then there's some arguments that then the budget committee should have some serious authority. Of course, then of course what the authority gets waived later on when it becomes inconvenient and impossible to hit, to deal with those limits. And so each committee, as you explained it, it's supposed to happen that way, but they don't really get a top line number that they're even working with. And
maybe technically they do. Maybe they're supposed to, but I know in the last 4 years.
It's just laughed out. It's just laughed out of the room.
Yeah, I think one of the things you can do is just get rid of the ability for the appropriations committee to deem a budget number. That's what happens when they don't pass a budget. They literally just come up with a deemed level that they mark up their bills to. So if you got rid of that,
they're like, here's the total amount after we did everything we wanted. If that doesn't fit with the original top line, so what?
Can you explain what deeming is?
Yeah, so essentially under the current budget process, the budget committee is given a couple months to write up a budget. And if they don't do that, the appropriations committee can deem top line levels for the whole discretionary budget for that year, as well as the budget for each of the 12 individual bills.
Right.
And they can just start the process of writing their bills. So that means that the budget committee is neutered at that point and doesn't have the ability to operate further on in the year. The other thing, and this idea was, I think, explained by Congressman Mike Gallagher from Wisconsin on your podcast, about maybe we should look at a more radical solution, which is to completely break down the firewall between authorizing and appropriations. So you have experts like him that are on the Armed Services Committee. Maybe they should actually have a role in writing the real budget.
Yeah, and you wonder what that might look like. Is it an appropriations subcommittee within every committee that's made up of those actual members? That could be an interesting way to deal with that. I don't know. even the conversation about the difference between authorizing and appropriating is very confusing to people. Maybe you can explain it in a simple way, because I can't actually.
I think the best example is if you look at the defense budget. So the defense budget is basically, it's an authorizing bill. So they set a framework for the department to operate. It sets personnel levels, it sets policy, it creates a framework, but it doesn't actually spend money. It doesn't give budget authority.
But it does have numbers in it.
It does have numbers in it.
It
but that
does have
doesn't
specific numbers, yeah.
It does. That doesn't actually become reality unless the appropriators follow up every year and put real budget authority towards it.
Mm-hmm.
And so right now, even though we passed a bipartisan National Defense Authorization Act, the Department of Defense cannot begin to execute at that level. They can't deal with all the emergent needs they have. They can't hire new people unless they have an actual appropriations bill. And that's why what we're dealing with now is so important.
And another clarification would be like the appropriations bills, they are just like, okay, here we go. We are giving you X amount of dollars. They're not going line by line into every program that the agency does. So for example, the EPA in an authorizing bill would go through program by program and say, we, the Congress, can tell you what to do. This is what we want you to do and be executing. Here is the money and how we want you to be spending the money and how many people to hire for these positions and what their qualifications are and what your objectives are. So that's authorizing. That's setting up a program. That's, putting like what's called a sunset in. So, your program expires at 5 years. And then the appropriators say, okay, here is, in the case of the EPA, here is $11 billion
for the program
run.
The authorizers wanted you to run.
Yes, for all of the programs.
And now the authorizers still set an amount, right? Because this is supposed to be the more expert committee on what they want the EPA to do.
Mm-hmm.
But the appropriators, I guess because the next question, of course, people listening to this are like, all right, guys, then why the hell do we even have an appropriations committee? Because it's not making sense. I guess the reason in theory would be that like an appropriator is getting the bigger picture in mind about where that top line budget is and where that money's going to come from, all of that. And so they're like, actually, we really can only put $8 billion into that particular program. I know you wanted 11, but we can really only put 8. What ends up happening though is the numbers always seem to go up in many cases. I don't know. A lot of times it's just what the authorizers want, but then they go up and down, and none of us really know why, right? And that's another mystery, I think, and because.
They cut a lot of deals. They cut a lot of deals, the authorizers and the appropriators, at least again in the healthcare space, when we deal with energy and commerce, healthcare versus appropriations. It's called the Labor H Subcommittee on Appropriations. There's a lot of back and forth. They don't want to appropriate funds to a mandatory or like an enforcement program. So instead that they will appropriate more dollars to a grant program. So that's kind of where the change happens. And again, our appropriators on the healthcare subcommittee of appropriations work really well with the energy and commerce healthcare subcommittee, and they try to get to some consensus. But in the middle, when you're trying to get a bill over the finish line, there's always wiggle room with the appropriators. And one of the biggest frustrations for authorizers, so again, energy and commerce would be an example, is unauthorized appropriations, because the appropriators are not supposed to create new programs.
Right.
You're not supposed to say, you know what, authorizers, it's been fun, y'all, we want to do this whether y'all authorize it or not. So we're going to give, this was the case of ARPA H. So ARPA H is a new program that was appropriated but not authorized.
Mm-hmm.
So the appropriator said, you know what, this is a Biden priority. We're going to give $40 billion to the creation of ARPA H, which is going to be like a DARPA, but for healthcare projects.
Yep.
The appropriator sent the money out the door. Biden started working on it, but there was no instructions from Congress.
Yeah.
And I fundamentally, as like a legislative branch staffer, fundamentally believe there has to be instructions from Congress. So one thing actually in the Omnibus is finally instructions from Congress on how to set up that ARPA H.
Right. Usually it's the other way around. Usually programs get authorized but not necessarily funded.
Yes.
That's a unique one, and a weird one. It's weird too because it ended up being a good bipartisan program that everybody likes for good reasons. Not too expensive, probably has some really good return on investment, but a lot of waste too. So maybe we should get to some of the politics of now. And so here's what everybody's upset about, especially in the House side. It's, we know we're taking the majority on January 3rd. And we also think that we'll probably have more leverage, we would think, in some of these negotiations if the House is led by Republicans. So the argument goes that Senate Republicans should have held off on this because they still need 60 votes to get anything through. So if Senate Republicans all united and said, no, not going to happen, and said instead, we want another continuing resolution, which we want to kick this can down the road a few weeks. That's what we want to do. And then we want to, because the people just elected a new House, and this argument obviously makes a lot of sense. I clearly agree with it. Now, the counter argument, if you're on the Senate Republican side, would be you guys don't have your shit together. You can't even elect a speaker right now, and this is a problem. We don't know what kind of chaos will happen in January. There's still 5 Republicans holding out against Kevin McCarthy, which is, I think is absolutely crazy, but they're doing it nonetheless. You're going to immediately take the House, and then there's going to be chaos, and you're going to look silly. We're going to prevent you from looking silly by keeping the country funded, at least for now. So that would be their counter argument. The counter argument would be, that was the whole point of the House being taken over by Republicans, is to put a brake on this out of control spending. And it is out of control spending. So I think another reason this year's budget is just, it's so emotional. It's not as if these levels are huge increases. There are definitely increases, and more than a lot of people think that should happen, especially on the non-defense side. They're not enormous increases from years past, but it has to be noted that we just spent trillions and trillions on the Inflation Reduction Act, on the infrastructure bill, on the American Rescue Plan. I'm not even, maybe, what is it, like 5 trillion? I mean, I'm not even sure what the top line number is. It's absurd. It's an absurd amount of money. That money is funneled through these agencies that we're spending money on. So they are just flush with cash. And why don't we stop and ask, where is all the money right now? Just a basic audit of what kind of funding our agencies have at the moment. How much of that can be used for funding your basic day-to-day operations, as opposed to us appropriating more money and putting us even more in debt? These are very reasonable questions to be asking. Didn't turn out that way.
It makes me crazy. And Matt, if you can maybe help me understand this, is, they were bragging about the EPA only got a very small increase over last year, but under the Inflation Reduction Act, they got, I don't know, just the Clean Air Office budget was now more than the EPA budget. The Clean Air Office is now getting $9 billion, and the entire EPA only got $9 billion one year.
This is a regulatory agency, and what are you even doing with this money?
They're going after Americans. They're going after Americans. They're slowing economic growth, and they're doing it with the taxpayer's dollar, which is incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, it's very creative accounting on their part. For those agencies, this is clearly a very huge increase in their funding. So the fact is we would get a much better deal next year. The question is about timing. And for many senators, they're just kind of questioning whether the Defense Department would have to wait for many months to finally get to a deal. That's just kind of an open question.
And it's also an open question, and I think this is their worry. So I'll give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they have legitimate worries that, okay, let's say every Republican did get together and do what they're supposed to do and not support Democrats and actually support the Republican nominee, Kevin McCarthy. Let's assume that happens on January 3rd. There's still only a very slim majority in the House. And look, there's plenty of Republicans who probably, it's hard to imagine what budget they would ever vote for. And, that would be their argument. Even if you do elect your speaker and get your committees started the way you're supposed to, which, by the way, we haven't done, especially for committees like Ways and Means. A very important one, by the way, Ways and Means. Another important one, Homeland Security, because these are contested races. I am in one of those races, of course. And so we should already know who's going to be chairman-elect for those committees. That's the normal process, but we don't because of this political drama with the speaker's race. So it is slowing us down, and obviously that is noted on the Senate side, I suppose. That would be the best argument for how they want to do things, because it's hard to see any other good arguments. It's not a good spending bill. I suppose there are other arguments would be how would you get a better bill, because we still don't control the Senate. They don't control the presidency. They don't have any kind of veto-proof majorities by any stretch. You have a very slim majority in the House. Who's to say that you even have that much more leverage? How much are we really going to be gaining with a $20 billion, $40 billion, drops in the bucket when you're considering the entire budget? And it's always important to remind people that when we are thinking about the entire budget, mandatory spending still accounts for almost 70% of all of our spending. It is that 70% is a lot, and we don't even vote on that. And that's all the stuff that it's really hard to get the American people to do away with, because you're talking about Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. And you take that back to your voters. Nobody wants to deal with those problems. Heck, you even hint at it, and the Democrats immediately put out campaign commercials against every Republican that they're going to cut your Social Security. That's a longer conversation, and I've had that conversation many times on this podcast. I'm willing to have it. I think it's a generational problem, where it's a younger generation pitted against an older generation. But if you actually cared about the budget, and it's not just grandstanding, you'd 100% focus on the biggest part of it, which is mandatory spending. We are fighting over small slivers of spending in the grand scheme of things when we fight about these discretionary spending bills. That's the fact. It's easy to grandstand on it because it's easy to pick things out of there that are just wasteful spending. It's really easy. But again, I'm a little bit taking both sides here because I want this to be an objective conversation. I fall on the side of this is a bad idea. We shouldn't be doing spending bills like this. But there's more to the context than this.
I think another thing that should, for at least again, my concern again with discretionary spending is making the government the customer. And this has been really bothering me over the last few years. Is the Biden administration has been moving to a perspective where the government is the customer. The government's making the rules, the government's doling out the grant money, the government's doling out the subsidies, and then they, in their benevolent wisdom, are figuring out who gets the money and who doesn't, and what programs we need to be investing in, and what levels of wealth and care everyone should be at. And it's very concerning because if the government is the customer for these businesses, you aren't. They, like with this, the latest Inflation Reduction Act, companies are not concerned about providing value to the customer. Companies are concerned about getting the subsidies, the grants,
yep,
following the regulations, and doing the kind of rent-seeking behavior and incumbency and crony capitalism and all these things that we used to hate as Republicans. They are now, the government is the customer. Mm-hmm. That's how it is in healthcare. That's how it is now becoming in energy. And it's very concerning. And the discretionary spending might not be, again, only a sliver out of our spending. But what's more concerning, it's building the case to make the government as the customer. And now the government gets to dictate the value and the needs of the person. And that's why I think capitalism.
The Inflation Reduction Act was the biggest example of that. I mean, that's almost entirely what you're talking about. And so, it's over, how much are we talking? What's our top line of the Inflation Reduction Act again? It was absurd. I've already put it aside, but
oh god,
it's and that's a great point to make. It changes the nature of the market. It changes incentives, and what the private sector is incentivized to do. Definitely taking place in energy, because when we're talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in grants and subsidies towards a specific kind of energy creation, namely solar and wind. There was some good stuff for stuff we like too, which was more sustainable energy sources like nuclear and carbon capture. But for the most part, is renewables. And if the market was left to its own devices, if the people were left to their own devices, they would not invest in those. They would not buy those because they're more expensive and they're less reliable.
Or they would invest in them in a way that makes sense. So like, does rooftop solar make sense for you? Yes. Okay. Well, then that is providing value, and like the signal that you spend your dollar on is going to show that dollar. You are the customer, you control the dollar. But, going back to government as customer, if they're dictating that solar needs to make sense even where solar shouldn't make sense, that's wrong. And I do realize I have done a classic Canna move and moved this conversation to my favorite topic. So I'll go back to the budget.
Budget in general terms.
Just to add one point on your comment about discretionary versus mandatory spending. It's exactly right that 70% is spending that we never consider on a year-by-year basis. But a lot of the spending during the pandemic was actually discretionary. Mm-hmm. So we've really reset that kind of baseline. And last year's big Omni was, it was like nearly 9% higher than the year before, and this one's 10% on top of that. So we're really ratcheting up quite a bit.
But that's the problem, right? The problem is the Inflation Reduction Act, the American Rescue Plan, the infrastructure bill. It just adds up this absurd amount. And that is discretionary, and it should. And that's a basic Republican argument here: is you don't need to be increasing on the non-defense side.
And then the other thing, though, is if you think about the amount of money we have to borrow, we're rolling over all that debt. Mm-hmm. This is a long-term debt. Interest rates have gone up. That just means every new dollar we borrow is going to have a snowball effect in the future. Mm-hmm. And so by the end of this decade, they're anticipating, this is even the Biden administration has this built in their forecast, $1.2 trillion just to service the debt. That's completely unsustainable. And that will happen at the same time when Medicare and Social Security are going insolvent.
Right. There's going to be some tough conversations.
Which, by the way, the HI Trust Fund, which is the hospital insurance trust fund that funds your like traditional Medicare, if like you're over 65 and you need to go to the hospital, that is what you pay into out of your taxes. That is going to be the first to go insolvent, and we're not talking about a 10-year range anymore. They're expecting in this decade that the HI Trust Fund is going to go insolvent. And insolvency means they're going to have to do across-the-board benefit cuts. And there are operators within the space of healthcare already jockeying for, can they make someone else take the cut and not them? And so Republicans next Congress, and this is why Ways and Means is so important and getting all this up and running is so important, is they've got to start figuring out a plan for how to protect the HI Trust Fund, how to protect Medicare, because the way that we've been running the budget the last few years, not just the last few years, but the last few decades, is really running the HI Trust Fund into the ground, into insolvency, and it's only going to hurt seniors. So all of these commercials of like, oh, you're changing the benefits, or you're tweaking this thing one way or the other, and now you're going to hurt seniors, like you were going to hurt seniors then, like watch out now when the HI Trust Fund goes insolvent, you're really actually going to hurt seniors because we didn't make some small but tough decisions in the past. We're going to have to make some very hard decisions in the future.
Oh, it's going to be disastrous. And everybody has this idea about mandatory spending and why Social Security is going bankrupt, why Medicare is going bankrupt. And the narrative often goes along the lines of, well, the government raided those trust funds and spent it on other stuff. And I hate to break it, it's just not true. It's completely false. The real problem is, we have an aging population. We started out these programs at like a 6-to-1 ratio, worker to senior. Now it's like 3-to-1. It's really that simple. It is basic demographics. And you either have to cut benefits or raise taxes. And so this is why I say it's a generational conflict, because who are you raising taxes on? Well, everyone to an extent, but you're effectively raising them on young people. They're the ones who are going to deal with those taxes for the next few decades. And is that fair, right? Because that's a wealth transfer. You're transferring wealth from people our age sitting around this table to people much older who I would argue have had many more years to save, start their businesses. It tended to grow up in an environment where housing and healthcare was cheaper, education was cheaper, arguably. This shouldn't be a left-right issue. Now, of course, what the left says is Democrats, they just want to raise taxes. They just, if you just take more money from billionaires, you can just pay for all this. Of course, I forget, we had these numbers a lot when I was on the budget committee. But if you confiscated like all the billionaires' wealth, well, by the way, you can only do that once. I hate to break it to everybody, but you can only do it once, and then they move their money elsewhere if they even have any left. It wouldn't even come close to paying for what we need to pay for. It's just not even close. So it just doesn't work. You have to have honest conversations, and people our age have to have honest conversations about when the right time is for us to retire. Maybe that's what we have to give from our generation. That's our general outlook as it.
And it's not just like, you don't have to think about it all, like, because I think we also present it in these like fatalist terms, like everything we're going to have to be, it's going to be bad, or it's going to be even more bad. But we can talk about economic growth. We can talk about like, what are the changes that we're doing that are actually going to grow the economy? I think that's TCJA was very important for economic growth. What about in healthcare? Like, what can we do?
That's the tax cuts.
Tax cuts.
That
Okay,
was the tax cuts.
I talk in acronyms. What can we do to grow like the economy, make things cheaper, increase value? And you would be surprised at the number of like very small changes that can be made within the healthcare system that would get the numbers you need for solvency in the HI trust fund. Although I'm sure my Ways and Means friends would disagree, but it also requires us to push back on some of the incumbency with companies and say like, hey guys, I know this is going to hurt your bottom line very like immediately, but this is going to help everyone in the long term.
Yeah. The healthcare space in particular is tough, is because every group seems to be pitted against each other.
Yeah.
And there's very little consensus in the healthcare space about what the best solutions are to make the entire system work better. You're making somebody mad, and it's hard. Healthcare is a difficult concept. We've done that we've done quite a few episodes on that. We're not going to get too far into that right at the moment.
It could be fun.
It could
I'm
be.
Just kidding.
I think we hit a lot actually, and I have to go soon. What else do we want to say here about this budget? We didn't go through the details of the budget because it's 4,000 something pages.
We could.
Yeah.
Well, it's 4,000 pages, but then like there's actually a lot of explanatory material. So it's who knows how many thousands.
That's actually one thing I wanted to let people know is I do not think anyone should always accept the argument is I can't vote for this because I didn't have time to read it. I don't think they were ever going to read it if they had 6 months, because bills are often in sort of esoteric legal language. It is a team effort to quickly digest what is in a bill. This is always how it works up here. You've got many, many people reading it. It's not like every member is studying each bill by candlelight every night before they go vote. That's not how it works, right? You first of all, you have experts from the different subject matters within a bill quickly explaining to you like what the top line is, like what you need to know about this, and especially with a budget, what has actually changed. As what is different from maybe what you expected. That information quickly gets to us. I rarely hear anyone ever give what would be a bad excuse as to, well, look, I voted for it, but I didn't know that part was in there. I just didn't know. I've never seen that happen, no matter how quickly a bill comes to the floor. There's always rumors. There's always something. There's always ways to get that information. I hate that excuse. Doesn't make the process good. It is still a foolish process. Like, there should still be more debate and an ability to make little changes to it. But it's also easy to say, the counter argument to that, it's also easy to see how that would quickly make a deal fall apart and make it almost impossible. I think the conclusion then is that this is not an easy process. It's not obvious how to make it better. Anyone who tells you it is kind of full of it. Calling for regular order is exactly the right thing to call for, but I hope after this conversation people understand why that falls apart. Why? Again, start thinking about it. Okay, so we want to get this appropriations bill through. Well, one side doesn't want to vote for that, and you're in a divided government. Okay, fine, we'll vote for it, but you got to do something for me on that other appropriations bill, because that's a big priority for us. All right, fine, but if we're going to do that, then you have to increase some spending here on defense, because we got to get our shipbuilding capabilities back on track. And you can quickly see how this becomes one giant deal. This is how it happens.
I mean, they were saying that the 11th hour negotiations were held up on what's the new location of the FBI. because it's been a decades-long fight. They're rebuilding or moving the FBI out of like 8th and Penn, downtown DC, to Maryland or Virginia. And there was news stories about, all of the staff was waiting on the text of the omnibus just so that we could start going through it. And it didn't come out until 1:40 on Tuesday morning, very early. And one of the reasons why was, okay, we're going to cut a deal. Is it going to be Maryland or Virginia?
That's dumb. I didn't even know we were moving the FBI headquarters. I mean, this is how silly it can get. That is a really ugly building. I mean, it should be moved. So,
I mean, look, Dan, we're good staffers, so we like to tell you that we do love reading the appropriations bill. You've got two big old nerds here, so we like going through a decent portion of it. And it is, you're right, it's a team-based sport.
It's a team not only within our office, because again, everybody's looking at different parts of it. And then I'm synthesizing all that information as quickly as we can. But it's not just you guys, it's the whole conference.
Yeah.
And it's committee staff. And so, we do get the main parts of it, right? And as we assess whether to vote yes or no, it's a judgment call, right? On like, what is the threshold for how much negative stuff we see? And on this one, the threshold, it was met. Like there's enough negativity about this entire bill where, if you quiz me on what's on page 1,000, obviously I can't tell you, but the negativity is high enough at this point. The politics are toxic enough where it is not the right thing to do, in my opinion, to vote yes. But I just don't listen to anyone when they tell you they couldn't read it. Just have them tell you why they're against it. Okay, make the congressman work for their paycheck. That's all I'm getting at here. I think about the reading it part. I think we beat that dead horse. Oh wait, Stanford said we can't say that anymore.
Oh God.
Can't say beat that dead horse. Because
I was reading a study about trigger words. And
by Stanford? You can't say trigger actually either, according to Stanford. You're
what?
basically not allowed to talk. You can't say he or she. Don't say preferred pronouns. Don't talk.
Your body language is offensive too.
You know what? I'm being bullied.
I
read 2 studies.
Be
about
brave,
how
Hannah.
I work with you both every day.
No, you can't say brave either. It's another.
Regardless, can I say that?
Oh, look, I'll check the list.
So anyway, there are 2 studies that say trigger warnings don't work, yet we still are using them. And so those are both peer-reviewed journal articles, and you're welcome. That's all I was trying to say.
That's good. One thing I noticed about the Stanford word list was it's real heavy on Native American anything. Like, at what point do we just acknowledge that the left is trying to erase any reference to Native American culture at all, even the positive stuff, which it all is. All of these phrases none of them are derogatory. It drives me nuts. But maybe that's for another podcast. Thanks for listening, everyone. Hope you learned something about the budget. And it was great. People loved it. And hope it was both clarifying and infuriating. Thanks, everybody. Signing out. Okay.